this around. Hello folks, I'm Ian McAllister from The Giant Brain. I'm a tabletop games critic and podcaster as well. I'll be your host for this little chat about fantasy and folklore. Hold any sort of questions to the end if you can. We'll have about 20-30 minutes at the end of question and answer with the panel. So fantasy is kind of core of the tabletop hobby. Every game, every experience, everything we do is a sort of chance to imagine things that we wouldn't really get away with in real life for a lot of the time. From delving into dungeons to flying between the stars, these are the things that we can make real in games. But where do these fantasies, where do these sort of folklore tropes come from? What's their origin? That's what we're going to look at today in this chat. Where does the inspiration come from for the fantasy around our tables? Today we're going to dive into the world of fantasy and folklore to ask what they mean, where they come from, and how we can use them at our tables while still being respectful to the cultures that have created them in the first place. But it's not going to be me talking about that. To discuss this, I've got a group of panelists here who I'm going to let introduce themselves, who are much more knowledgeable than me on folklore and fantasy. Starting with the person to my left, and we'll go down the panel.
Hello, I'm Bryan Tyrell. I'm the graphic designer and also a writer at Stout Press. My most current project right now, relevant to folklore and fantasy, I'm working on a book called Carved in Stone. I would describe it as sort of like an encyclopedia of Pictish history. So it's a summary of everything we know about the Picts culturally around the 7th century. And that's had a lot to do with folklore because there's a lot of, I would describe it as misconceived and I guess just sort of like misappropriated folklore around the Picts. A lot of kind of Celtic imagery that really doesn't actually fit any of the evidence that we have for them right now, and so that's been a really kind of core part of the project, is sort of unpicking and unweaving that.
Oh, that was great. So my name is Pablo Clark. I have a background in mainly AAA video games. I'm an illustrator and animator, and more recently I designed and illustrated a board game called the Old King's Crown. I had to remember the name there, and and it's got a lot of folklore and fantasy embedded in it, and I think that fantasy is very interesting. It's a huge space, and I think it is our job to make it explore the more interesting parts of it. I think that sometimes it becomes too rote. That would be my contribution.
Hi, my name is Blackwell. I'm a solo RPG creator based here in Scotland. My most folklore-related project is Apothecaria. It's a game where you're playing as a witch curing various fantasy diseases, many of which have roots in Scottish folklore and British folklore. And many of the events you explore, because it is a fantasy version of the Highlands, include kind of nods to things like the Cusaith, Loch Ness Monster, the Blue Men of the Minch, stuff like that. I'm excited to be here. It's my first panel.
Lynne.
Hello, I'm Lynne Hardy. I am the line editor for the Rivers of London role-playing game at Chaosium, and also the senior associate editor for Call of Cthulhu. So Rivers of London, if you don't know, is Ben Aronovich's series of urban fantasy novels. But I've worked on quite a few different games over the number of years I've been in the gaming industry, and fantasy and folklore plays a big role in a lot of the research I do for the stuff that I write.
Cool. Can I just get you to sit a little bit forward, folks? Just
Sure.
Yeah. Okay, so I thought I'd start with like a really, really easy question. What is folklore? And can we define fantasy in a sort of useful manner?
I think
No.
Next.
Well, someone this afternoon, actually Phil, the gentleman who's running the game jam, because I said, I meant to look it up on the internet, I'm going to look so disorganised. And he said, oh no, apparently it's a story that becomes legend that is used as a teaching tool.
Okay.
Which is certainly an interesting way of looking at it.
Yeah, I mean, I can see that. Like, a lot of early folklore was educational in a sort of way, like teaching about, like, you know, that's a bad place to go because there be dragons, literally.
Yeah, I think folklore is a way, and I would say fantasy is a way of making sense of things that you otherwise don't understand or you don't feel comfortable understanding. So if if something is threatening or unknown, it is useful to quantify it and create a shape for it. And I think that's what folklore is. That's its role, at least in part, traditionally, was to give shape to things that people didn't understand. Yeah. And I think it's very valuable, and it's very pertinent even now, because I think that one of the things that can be mistaken for folklore is this idea of attaching antiquity to it. But I think that, especially in the modern world, where news is unreliable, or there's a huge amount of data streaming past us, that folkloric characters or events are created almost daily now. Like a good example would be on the space station at the moment. Right. Yeah. Like the idea of folklore is that I know that something is happening there, and that's more interesting to me than the reality, which I imagine is like a pipe, knocking against another thing. But what it could represent is almost infinite if it has a story attached to it. So I'd say that's the role of folklore, and it's why it is still pertinent, and it's why fantasy is still interesting, and it's why science fiction that spirals off from that is also interesting.
I think also you've got elements of hope in there as well. I mean, I grew up down the road from the Major Oak in Sherwood Forest, so you've got Robin Hood. So there's that hope element in that folklore, that there's someone fighting for the little guy, there's someone looking out for them. It's not all doom and gloom because there's someone who cares about you. So there can be, I mean, not all fantasy and folklore, but I think in some there is that as well.
I think fallibility is an important part of folklore, and it's relevant to the educational element as well. So basically, not all folklore is real, but there's a belief in it that makes it feel real. That belief makes it feel pertinent, feel relevant. There might not be dragons, but a story about a dragon can be inspiring. Equally, folklore can be created to teach messages, but the source that it's being inspired from might not be real. I mean, gossip told enough times becomes folklore, and the people affected by that gossip originally, it might not be real, it might not be true, and it might be not representative of that person or those people or that event, but it becomes real, in air quotes, because it's been told so often and so much. It's how we get trope, it's how we get a lot of negative stereotypes. That's a form of folklore too. So I like the idea of the definition of folklore being like stories that people are telling to teach, but what is being taught, how it's being taught, the reason why it's being taught, what it's trying to evoke in people, those are all subject. They can be fallible, they can be false, for different reasons and for positive and negative outcomes.
Yeah, it sort of serves as like a lens to try and understand the world. Like a lot of kind of folklore comes from like medical conditions. Revolver is a medical condition that like causes you to grow fur all over your body, which people believe is like has roots for werewolf mythology. So yeah, again, that lens of like trying to make sense of the world while not having all of the information, like the pipe on the space station.
Right. yeah.
Because humans have always loved telling stories. It's more interesting to be like, oh yeah, this person turns into a wolf every like full moon, when in reality this person has a very probably sad life.
We've talked about like sort of antiquity versus modern. Pablo, you mentioned there for like sort of the creation of folklore. Where do a lot of sort of folklore tropes come from? What sort of communities create them? And in the modern sense, are we talking about, is mean culture folklore effectively, that kind of thing? Can we count it as folklore?
I think folklore. I think it inhabits an interesting space where imagination takes root.
Yeah.
I think that the more prescriptive you are, the less the folkloric story loses its, the more it loses its power. And I think if we're going to talk about how that applies to fantasy or writing or all these sorts of things, I think the more that you resolve something, potentially the more power you remove from it. So if you want to introduce a threat, folklorically or in any way narratively, by othering it, by having it something that is not explained, that cannot be understood, and crucially does not reflect the people in the immediacy around you, you can create a very potent fear of like a symbol of fear.
Yeah.
And that can be very destructive, or it can be very useful. I mean, if you're using it as a writing trope, for example. But there's all sorts of... There's power to be gained by not quantifying the thing. And I think that's where a lot of folklore draws its power from, and its enduring fascination. Yeah. You know, even in modernity, right? Which is this idea that, you know, the world is mapped. The world is understood. Yeah. There is no there's no sea that hasn't been crossed, and yet the space station, the clanging in the space station, is the unknown element, and you can see people grasping for it as a kind of unknown thing. And why is it so intoxicating? Because that's where imagination takes root, between the discrepancy between what is understood and what is not understood, but what is being positioned. You know.
And having that openness, of course, allows each different generation, community, to put their own stamp on it, to twist it ever so slightly to suit its purposes. Whereas if it's really tightly codified, as you say, there's nothing for them to add to make it their own. And I think there's that element of ownership as well bleeds into folklore. That's our history, even if we know it's not necessarily real, or there's fantastical elements to it. But it's ours. We can put our stamp on it. It belongs to us.
Which is something that's really interesting to see with like cryptid art nowadays. Like going on the concept of like being othered, you see a lot of like othered communities taking like cryptids like Mothman and taking it from like a omen of like ill fortune and turning it into a sex symbol, because they identify with it and they create this almost folk hero to them, which is something that's really interesting to see happen to vampires and werewolves and everything, like given time.
Yeah.
I like to think that folklore is about the message, and again, we're talking about the educational aspect. It's the lesson that you're trying to impart. There's this Twitter bot that I follow that's really funny called Mythology Bot, and there's this huge database of mythology and folklore research that condenses all the different folkloric tropes into individual aspects and elements, and the bot just shuffles them and prints out like a 240 character tweet of like, man grows grass from armpit, then ascends. And it's meaningless. Like, they're just randomly fragments. But the fact that they're combined together tells a story, implies something, growth and then ascension, and where are they going to go from there, and where have they gone? What does it mean? Humans love to pull meaning from patterns. And so it's less about the specific content of the actual folklore, but instead the overall message that it's trying to convey. Humans, danger, protection, society, togetherness, working together, growth, interdependency. These are all themes that folklore implies. And so when we think about, say, Mothman is not the folklore, it's the othered, and then subversion of that, the finding grace and love and self-enjoyment in the other, being loving of oneself. Like, it's about playing with the different messages and the arcs and how you identify and resonate with the thing, rather than the thing itself. So when there's folklore about a group of people, or about an object, or about a cryptid, it's not the specific thing, it's the expression of that thing.
Do you think there's something in... That's very the specific thing. Do you think there's something in the fact that folklore exists when something isn't solved? Like, if something is not solved, if something is not contained completely, that's where folklore really thrives.
I would agree, because ultimately, again, humans love to seek for patterns and to look for shapes, familiarity. It's in our brains. We're hardwired to recognize faces wherever we look. So when we don't have something solved and we can't confirm the absolute boundaries of it, we can keep finding infinite patterns. We can keep exploring.
Can I throw something against that slightly?
Yeah.
Taking for a moment the possible idea that like conspiracy theories are effectively a form of folklore.
Sure. Yeah.
Flat Earth. I mean, it's basically solved, right, that the Earth is not flat. To anyone with
No.
Sorry to any flat earthers in the crowd.
I'm a flat earth. No, I'm not. I'm absolutely not.
But you know what I mean? There's scientific known fact now. We still get these things coming out.
But it is not solved in the immediate moment, right? That is that you cannot be confronted with the enormity of the Earth, right? And unless you are up there, right? There is all science can lead that way, and of course it's correct. I'm not saying it's. I am not saying that Earth is flat, but I think.
Exclusive on
but I think the reason why flat Earth still exists is because it's really hard for them to be confronted with the absolute truth of the thing. In the peripheries exists the doubt. If they cannot be confronted with the round globe, then it allows doubt to percolate.
So we should shoot flat earthers into space.
Yes, get them high and just see it. Just
Getting
you can
high?
see. Big ladder.
I think another reframing of that sort of like you can't confront the enormity of it, but there's a yearning for something. I mean, like Pokemon. I love Pokemon. We all like a little electric rat that shoots a bolt.
Yeah.
They don't exist. But I want it. I want a Pikachu so bad. It's
What do you mean they don't exist?
Prove it. They're hiding them under the earth. There will always be a yearning for these things. I would love a werewolf boyfriend. I don't know many people who wouldn't. They don't exist, but I want one. It's that humans, we crave the pattern, we crave these things, these aspects, these desires. They take different forms. I don't think it's as easy saying, well, we proved the Earth is flat, so blah, blah, blah. Humans are messy. Humans are gross, weird creatures. Folklore is an expression of that grossness.
Yeah.
There's also, unfortunately, a growing distrust in the information we receive.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Which I think is what's fueling a lot of the conspiracy theory, movements. Flat Earth is just a reaction to not feeling like you can trust what you're being told, which is unfortunate, because obviously worse things are coming out of it as well, but, in some ways, it's understandable. We get thrown so much information on a daily basis. You can kind of see why some people do question it. It's just that they are perhaps questioning the wrong things.
I could go on about this topic for a long time.
But we're getting away from folklore there.
I've got about a million questions about information and politics and folklore in my head. But let's bring things back to
we'll bring it back to IOPS.
Let's bring it back a little bit to games itself. So we've sort of talked about sort of where folklore comes from and the sort of modern interpretations of folklore. How have you folks used folklore in either running your own games or creating games, because you all create products? How have you looked at folklore and interpreted it and used it in games to sort of make your own fantasy worlds and make them feel real?
I really want to jump in and be like, I actually try and take as much folklore out as possible in a really fun way. So, Picts, I talk about Picts all the time. I feel like it's all I've been doing for the last 5 years. There is a very common conception of the Pictish people. They were, I guess to shorthand it, they were Scotland's native populace around 2,000 years ago to around 1,000 years ago. And there's this idea in the modern kind of narrative that they were these naked blue warriors who ran from the hills, woed, and they killed people. Rah! All of that was made up by the Victorians. It's fan fiction. And it's cool fan fiction. It's wonderful folklore and these kind of beautifully Celtic warriors sweeping through and killing the Romans and all this stuff. And it's so cool. The killing the Romans did happen. They did drive them out. That's really cool. But woad, incredibly toxic to put on your skin, and it's also not color fast, so if you use it as a tattoo it doesn't stay. It'll leave you with chemical burns, and also to get that blue color you have to use ammonia, and the most common form of ammonia is piss and poo. You would not put that on your skin. Folklore has done damage to the actual true narrative of what the Pictish peoples could have been, as we know from evidence, as we know from archaeological experimentation, looking at methods, looking at what was said and trying to practice it. So when working on a book of Pictish history, I have to go through the folklore and not only just think, well, what can I present to people, but how can I challenge current conceptions in a way that's not going to result in a flat earther ending where they go, well, no, that's not true. I don't trust any of this. It's trying to ease people into the actual historical accuracy that we do have while still leaving space for them to then make their folklore, because we don't know everything about the Picts. There's whole swaths of information. How the nobility worked, political hierarchies, little villages, how did they trade? All of this information is so speculative. And when you're making a role-playing game, you're making a setting guide, you want people to explore and play and have that flexibility. How do you present information? How do you skim away the folklore without preventing people from making folklore?
And it's what we were saying before about that the more you fix, the harder it is.
Absolutely.
It's the same in a game, because you have to leave room for people to add their own mythology, put their own folklore into it. Again, take ownership of that setting and make it their own thing. As a very scientific aside, my background is biomedical sciences, urea, which is obviously a major component of urine, can actually be very good for your skin. Ammonia, not so much. And urea tends to be found in an awful lot of hand creams. In fact, there are quite a lot of people worldwide who will rub urine on their skin and drink urine to help improve their general skin condition. So, again, that's the fascinating thing I love about science, is the fact that just tweaking it ever so slightly can turn something that could be good and beneficial to something, oh, my life, that's a chemical burn.
Yeah.
And did your college roommates appreciate that when they
Don't ask me what we used to get up to with dry ice, that's all I'm saying.
I mean, I have so many questions.
Let's change the panel.
We'll just quiz Lynne for the next hour.
Urea and dry ice in role-playing games.
Yeah, so like for like a big line like Rivers of London, Lynne, how have you sort of like brought the folklore side of that into that line?
Well, I mean, thankfully Ben did an awful lot of the work for me.
That's
So it's
true.
like I just go read the novels and go, oh, I'll have that. But again, the Rivers of London, that's sort of building on the idea of genii locorum, so spirits of place, which is a very old idea. And folklore elements, folkloric characters, like Reynard the Fox is one that pops up a few times. All sorts of interesting things, but then sort of looks at, well, how would that appear in a modern world setting as opposed to an older setting? How is that going to interact with the modern world? What is the modern world's reaction going to be to that if it discovers that it exists? Or how hard is that working to make sure the modern world doesn't find out it exists? So there's that interesting tension and balance that you have to look at. And it's like, well, is this a cool idea? Is this something that people are going to have fun with? Is there space within that for them to put their own stamp on it? Again, because some folklore, some stories, it's cool, but it's not necessarily going to make an interesting basis for a scenario for other people to play with. And that's always what you've got to have in the back of your mind, is like, is this going to spark people's imagination, creativity? Is it going to allow them to have fun? And some things will work in a particular game that might not work in one, but might work in a different one. And that's always what you have to keep in the back of your mind, is, are the players going to have fun with this if we present them with it? And you also, which is another topic that you mentioned at the beginning, is how do we have to handle this carefully so that we are not othering specific people, specific communities? Are we treating it respectfully if it's not from our own community?
Yeah.
So, I wanted to pick up on a point there that you said, that you used the word spark and space, which I think is very interesting, because both of those allow for room. The spark is the start of something, and space allows for all the things around it. And I think that's where folklore and fantasy derives a lot of its power from, and where it can be dangerous as well. But I think as writers and as creators, we should be, I think, and this is somebody, so I come from a background of video games and AAA video games in particular, that have an obligation now to solve everything, right? That's to say that if a creature is in a game, it's mapped out in full 3D, and it has how light will interact with it is solved, and its sound files are all solved, and its animation patterns are all solved. And I think the suggestion of the creature is much more interesting than the solving the creature. And so when the word spark and space is used, I think that's, and I also think that's where you avoid, stealing from other cultures wholesale. I think being inspired by things is very important. I think like a diverse, if you read a lot and if you look at a lot of things, I think that's a good thing. I don't think you are stealing from them. So long as you treat it with respect. And I think that giving an idea space is so important. So if anybody wants to do that, I think that's where you generate so much of its power. That's why you generate so much of its power. I firmly believe that if we give these ideas space, that is an amazing thing. The suggestion of something allows the imagination to take root, and the imagination is infinitely more potent than whatever it is that you've put down on the page, or at least in conjunction. I think if you can spark or leave space for something from one prompt or idea, then that allows the problem to not be solved, to not be shaped, but rather grow.
Ideally, when you're writing a scenario, you are providing a framework for others to build on and giving them that spark and that space.
Yeah.
And that's when people are going to have the most fun with it. And again, because they're putting their own stamp on it, they're making it their own. They're invested in it.
What about for yourself, Anna, in your work?
So I make solo role-playing games. So all of my games are games where I will provide these little scene prompts, this little spark, and then give the player like as much space as they need. One of my favourite events in Apothecaria is the Kusith, which in Legend, if you hear its bark 3 times, then you die. So the event is basically, you hear the first bark, good luck. It tells you, you need to find somewhere to hide before the third
two
bark.
left.
Two left. Every time you
great.
get it, you hear another bark.
Great.
And basically, if you hear all 3, then your character dies.
Great.
And it's usually a cozy game.
Usually.
Yeah. Like some of Scottish mythology, it's hard to take the teeth out of it. So yeah, again, that whole idea of spark and space, in solo RPGs, we work together on Apothecaria, mixing your game Scurry, my game Apothecaria, and you're working with such small amounts of space when you're making these games. So like 3 lines to encompass an entire folkloric idea, explain what it is, and also how you want the player to engage with it. So we don't have the luxury of fully explaining what the creature is, how it works, what it looks like. And I think that is what's powered that game's success. Because it's giving the people here's a rough idea of what it is, and if you want to know more, go read. That's always a great thing to go do. Or enjoy the fact that you don't know, that it is a monster, it is a shadow to you.
I think also something that's really fun with Apothecaria, which essentially your little animals on adventures through the woods. It's kind of set in Loch Lomond of the Trossachs in a sort of post-human future. It's kind of like Redwall-esque. Is a recontextualizing of what is known into what becomes unknown. What's really fun in that setting is that all of the animals are divided into beasts and behemoths. The beasts are things like squirrels and badgers and rats and pigeons, and they're all small and twee. And then you have the behemoths. You have the bears and the geese and the wolves, and they're big. And that's the dragons. That's the scary thing. It's these creatures who live so much longer than you and are so much bigger than you. And one gulp and you're gone. It reframes how you have mythology and folklore around death. How does an animal know when they're going to see their friend again if their friend might be eaten tomorrow and that's normal?
Or lives a day or something like that. Yeah.
So and then we really dived into the concept of human creation as mythology, as folklore, because the humans are gone and these animals don't really have a reference point for what these things are. So you can find little mechanical objects that may be able to work. There's a lovely piece of art with a salamander has found a phone. It's just got a nice big bit of decoration, and occasionally you see the paw on it.
It's my favourite illustration because it's in the multiplayer section. There's Discord on the phone.
I just want to pick up something Anna said there. You said something about sort of removing the teeth from like some folklore, and some folklore to modern audiences would be distasteful to some of the story, like have themes in it or motifs that we find incredibly distasteful.
Yes.
How do we go about adapting those folk stories while removing those elements while still retaining their essence?
Again, I think it comes down to each individual piece of folklore and you as a creator and how you're going to adapt that. So much kind of Highland folklore involves sexual assault, kidnapping, and I try and avoid that stuff because I don't know how to make that fun. No. I don't want to make that fun. I just want to not really get into that. But then it's like, you've got all these like creatures who, this was like stories of basically, don't you go over that mountain or you'll die. And it's like, well, how do we make that fun in a game? Because like you, I did video games before going into tabletop stuff, so we're used to like creating boundaries, but also no one likes just being told you can't go there or you'll die. Really.
So I have another fun little case study from Pitland. It's folklore, it's mythology, it's religion. We have saint worship, a lot of it in Pitland in the 7th century. And saints are a really interesting blend of living faith, because there are still many people across the world who engage in a form of Christianity where they worship saints, and they also then worship Christ and God through saints and along saints. And how saint worship existed in the 7th century is different to how it is in the 20th century. And saints have these insanely cool stories about them. There is a specific one, we'll talk about, it borders on, but it's a lot safer to talk about for sexual assault. There's the story of Saint Trudelana. She was, we think, 5th century a woman, and essentially she immigrated into Scotland, and she caught the attention of a Pictish king who fell in love with her and would not leave her alone. Like, please marry me, you're gorgeous. And she was a Christian nun, and she was like, no, I don't want to do that, go away. And eventually, she plucked her eyes out, skewered them on pin, and said, if you love my eyes so much, if you love gazing at me so much, you can have them, take them. And he was so shamed by this action that he gave up all advances, and then he ultimately didn't marry, forsook it, and was just shamed into not doing that again. And that's a large part of the story. And then from that act, she then was able to perform healing miracles, which then was what turned her into a saint, in that she could lay on hands and cure blindness. And that is a story that touches on a lot of different themes that are about sort of unwanted advances, male-female relationships, violence, and from a historical perspective, we don't know to what degree that story has been modified and changed to update to current standards at that time, and then sort of just become like a whisper chain, just modified slowly, bit by bit by bit. So the story doesn't necessarily reflect a Pictish culture, even though it is Pict-ish, having been from that time period and originating from there. But also, it's a vector by which we can talk about these sorts of themes, so it's important to display. But also, we can't make comments about what it says for the Picts, what it says for Christian identity, because what saint worship is then and what it is now and how it's changed is affected by a million different lenses. So the best way to present it is actually just neutrally, to say, there is saint worship, and you know people who worship saints, and these are some of their stories that they've told you. And then we just present the story, and we've emphasized this is important to people. We don't say why it's important, how it's important, just that it is. And that allows people to have the conversation to say, okay, well, what does saint worship mean to me? What could it mean for this story? We don't even say saints are real, saints can lay on hands, because that has so many implications for people today, and comments on whether worship and spirituality is relevant to medical practices. We just say, this was important to people, this is the story, go play.
Lynne, for yourself, with adapting a series of books, culture obviously changes very fast, and there might be some stuff in those books that today's audience would find distasteful. How do you go about sort of picking that apart, and does Ben just give you carte blanche to do what you want, or do you have to go back and forth on those things?
I work very closely with Ben, and Ben is very careful to try and avoid things being distasteful. Obviously, the lead character, Peter Grant, is mixed ethnicity, so yeah, he suffered racism.
Yeah.
He suffered profiling. He's a member of the Metropolitan Police Force. Some of the Met are racist, but it's something that is, yeah, I know. And who'd have thunk it? It's acknowledged, but it isn't it's not the core part of the thing, so the stories, but it isn't sort of like, oh, let's just not pretend this happens, let's just hide it away. So, and I think acknowledgement is important. Thankfully, obviously now in gaming, we're seeing the rise of the use of safety tools, which is great, because it means that you can have those individual discussions about what is acceptable at our table. Do we want this as part of our game? Do we want to use this to explore something that we wouldn't normally encounter? Or, we want to deal with it in a safe space where when it gets too much we can just go, no, we want to walk away from this now. So I think I'm wandering off topic now, but that is, it's having those tools there means that you can look at some of these unpleasant elements, these darker elements, in a safe way and explore them, because, some people might want to do that as part of the game, but other people, it might be their lived experience and they might not want to deal with it. So you have to have those options available to people.
So you're basically sort of safety tools give you as designers and writers a little bit more way to include that stuff, and then say, if you don't want to include this in your game,
please, I put content warnings at the beginning of everything, and just say, these are the themes. Make sure you've talked about them with your players. Make sure that your players are happy with this. Know where the boundaries are, so that everyone is comfortable, everyone is enjoying themselves. You're not pushing people into discussing and experiencing things that they don't want to discuss or experience for whatever reason. Let's take it away from fantasy slightly and go to the hideous old one in the room, Lovecraft. Because let's face it, not a nice man. But it's interesting in the fact that the mythos was always really a shared world. It's our shared world now. It's up to us to do with it what we want. So it's being redefined, it's being shaped. I have friends who are trans, queer, who actually really identify with quite a few of the characters in Lovecraft stories because they are other. They are aside from the main society. And that's actually been a great comfort and a help to them in some ways. So having a character that they can identify with, even if that's the last thing that Lovecraft was thinking about, and probably, hopefully, spinning in his grave. My plan is to get him spinning fast enough that we solve the world energy crisis. But that's how things can change. And again, coming back to people taking ownership of it and making it do what they need it to do. So even something that started off quite dark, quite offensive, can be repurposed by people through taking ownership of it.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of the Arkham Horror LCG, Fantasy Flight Games, and they've done quite a lot of work in sort of subverting Lovecraft's hateful views, and introducing interesting characters that a whole gamut of sort of sexualities and genders and ethnicities, and really sort of allowing people to see themselves in those characters and to play that game while sort of pushing aside the more distasteful elements. So it's sort of being changed over time, and like I say, it's been taken in by the community and changed for the better. And that's the thing with all folklore, as we've sort of coming to the conclusion, is that it evolves. Yeah. So with RPGs, obviously there's a continuous sort of feedback from the community, stories you create, scenarios you create, that kind of thing. Pablo, for Old King's Crown, obviously it's a board game, it's a lot more static. Yeah. How has your sort of inclusion of folklore, or have you created your own folklore in that game, and how do you feel it's different from the stuff that happens in RPGs? So I think if you're making anything, especially if it's non-historical, which is I find it very interesting to leave landmarks. So when we were doing this panel and we introduced ourselves before the panel started. When we were talking about what we were going to discuss, I said one of my favourite writers is Mervyn Peake, and Mervyn Peake wrote a series of books called Gormenghast. And what I really like about those books is that the world is never quantified. The size and scope of the thing expands and contracts as they need it to be. And there are proper nouns in that book. Obviously, there are named characters and there are named places, but those shift around in their relationship with each other, which is actually, I think, what folklore does very well. So with Old King's Crown, it starts off with the gambit that the old king is gone. And it's amazing how many people describe it as the old king has died, but it never says that. In fact, I'm more interested in it being a King Lear situation, or more interested in being abdication, or more interested in it being he's been usurped. Like that. We never say it, but it's interesting that people interpret it in certain ways. And so I'd much rather ambiguity allows the seeds of their own idea to go, and then. We do have proper nouns in the game, and there are named characters, but
their relationship to each other and time is very like odd in the game. Like I've pitched it as this kind of a world of palimpsests, a lot of ideas laid on top of each other, and there is no kind of coherent amount of technology or anything like that. Like I don't think that solving things in fantasy is interesting. I think that positing things is interesting, and I think so. Yeah, that's space and non-prescriptive would be my thing.
I'm sort of struck with, we've talked about sort of like folklore, like leaving spaces for people to like create their own sort of stories within folklore and in the products you create. It strikes me that it's quite an antithesis to sort of fandom. For instance, like where it's like Star Wars fandom, MCU fandom, that kind of thing, where everybody wants to know everything very precisely, and like know that the thing they're watching fits into a particular timeline, that kind of thing. Have you folks ever, like, in the things you've created, have you come across fans and consumers that really want to know more, and you've just had to tell them to go away, or how do you handle that, and how do you tell them that, like, the gaps are kind of the point? How do you deal with that kind of stuff?
I feel almost like, without first getting to specific examples of fandom happening, fandom is, again, it's that love of folklore. Everyone guessing what's going to happen on the next episode, they want to know what's going to happen. They want to make sense of something they don't understand, and so they come up with theories. You get people then exploring alternative realities of what could be, or what could that mean, and taking the same shapes and symbols, and that's how you get fan fiction. It's, again, a very, very human thing. I don't think it's antithetical to folklore. I think fandom is folklore.
Oh, yeah, that's interesting. So for me, like, I really don't know much about Star Wars. I really like know very little about it. But I know that it's positioned, but it's positioned as in a galaxy long, far away. Right? But that's more interesting than it exists exactly 200,000 light years away. It's much more interesting that there is a gulf of time and space between it. Yeah. So where it exists and the rules that govern it, are not defined by our same ones. If we could, but I find that very interesting. A fandom as folklore, that is very interesting, and the idea of like taking something and then recontextualizing, that is very interesting. Yeah, for sure.
To answer what you were saying about like with our own communities, I think because I primarily make solo RPGs. Nothing that I write is canon. Like, there's no next episode. There's no how does this fit in? Because all of that is given to the player. So I've never noticed like people coming in with this like concept of how does this fit into the multiverse. I think that's because like the player has the power in those type of games to create their own meaning, their own connections.
I know there's something that I've written at the start of every solo game I've published, including with the Porticaria, is you can break the rules if you want to. No one's looking over your shoulder.
Yeah, exactly. I'm not your mum.
What's really, really fun is, Anna, you've got a really great Discord where you've got like separate channels for each of your games. And for all of your solo ones, you've got like a journal sharing space where people get to share their stories and what's going on. What I find really, really fun is when someone shares a story and they've misread a rule and they've done something that was against the rules, but they've told a really fun story anyway, and they've played the game correctly. They got a fun story out of it, and they made great art, and they're really happy, and they're so enthusiastic about it. That's great. Yeah. There's no canon. It's true for them.
And that's the interesting thing. You just hit the nail on the head there. The rules, like a good scenario, are there as a framework and support. They are not the be-all and end-all. Mm-hmm. It is the story that you are telling with them that is important. And if you misread one and you end up with a great story, yay!
Yay! You didn't misread it, it worked.
It worked. It created something beautiful, and that's the whole point.
And if you misread it and make something bad, that's on you.
We'll take all the credit. So when it's a good mistake, it goes credit is yours. When it's a bad mistake,
of course.
Page 1, you do whatever you like. Final page, we take all credit.
If you enjoyed it, we take credit. If
you didn't,
that's your fault.
No refunds.
No I just put Bryan's email even if he wasn't involved in the project.
That's fair. So, we've talked about the past and kind of present of folklore a bit. And how do you, as tabletop gaming is obviously becoming much more mainstream over the last few years, the rise of like Dungeons and Dragons becoming huge, like actual play series, like really bringing RPGs into the mainstream, board games becoming a massive multi-billion-dollar international hobby. How do you see sort of folklore evolving and supporting those games as we continue to grow? How do you think it'll sort of change over the course of the next few years?
I mean, Anna's already hit the nail on the head. You know, it's the fact that oh, my brain's just gone completely blank. Sorry, I've been up since 5 o'clock this morning, and I have a really salient point to make, and then my brain just went no.
I feel I've been up since about the same time. I'm completely on board.
Come back to me on that one. Hopefully my brain will catch back up again.
I want to hear how I'm great.
You are great.
I want
What's
to
your
jump in
brain?
and just say that, I mean, role-playing games, again, it's human storytelling, it's folklore. I mean, who uses the same set of D&D rules at the same table? No one does. We all have our own variants, our own home rules, and we have greater, more cohesive folklore coming out of, say, actual plays, your how do you want to do this moments, and and critical hits aren't in the rulebook. There is no critical hit or critical miss, but they've become something because so many people just subscribed to it, believed in it. I feel like folklore's already in role-playing games. But if you want to talk about specific roots and sources to pull into folklore, I feel we've just got to find ways of, again, like reading widely, finding our inspirations, and honouring, but not without devouring, if that makes sense. That sense of if you just take one source and then put that one thing in, that's stealing. But if you read widely, if you're inspired, if you know the greater context, then you can work with it. A kind of a relevant point to that, talking about archaeology, when we talk about cultures from the past, an important thing to do when interpreting cultures from the past is to realize that you will never be part of that culture. No matter how close you are, no matter how descended you are from a culture, the further away you get, generation by generation, thousands of years, it's just a different world, and your contexts are different. Everything you've learned is different. So no matter how close you read or feel to something, it's never going to be yours. The only culture you have is your own culture. And so when it comes to taking in folklore, that sense of like you can resonate and identify and find the strands, and then find ways of expressing your own culture and exploring your own self through your stories, because that's what you're going to be able to do best.
Yeah.
And let's face it, as gamers, we develop our own folklore every time we play.
Yeah,
There's that
exactly.
amazing story, that fantastic character death, that awesome NPC. You're building those stories together, developing your group's own individual folklore.
I just wanted to touch on what Bryan said there about sort of like critical hits and misses. Do you think like sort of folklore can affect games mechanically as well as narratively, like affect like how they're sort of perceived by the community? As like sort of like rules are interpreted and changed, and like people find the best ways to do things. Do you think sort of folklore has a place in the more sort of mechanical side of RPGs?
Yeah, definitely. And I think
or games as well, I guess. House rules exist, for instance.
It's texture, isn't it? I think if you use the story or the setting or the ambience, all these things can be derived from these things. Then they're adding the mechanical texture to what you're doing. And I think if you're starting to take that into consideration, for example, you were saying there was you had made an RPG about there was a kind of like tiered hierarchy between the beasts and the behemoths, right? So like there's a lot of texture in that about mechanically you at a very simple level, it might just be very, very difficult for you to sustain or achieve anything on the lower rung, or be almost numerically impossible to confront a larger thing, and that would instantly posit the thing that it's not like again, this idea of it's being solvable, like a. And then in that texture, you start to create the silver bullet, or you start to create the steak, or you start to create the garlic, right? That like that's the thing that solves it. It's like folklore looks for solutions to impossible things. Again, the space station.
Yeah.
Notice that I didn't say aliens because I wanted to be like, no, it's obviously a sensible, thing, and it's a rattling pipe, right? That's steak, that's garlic, that's silver bullet, that is what it's holy water, it's all these things. In that it starts to create mechanics. If for example folklore presents a an unsolvable thing, or something that threatens your player's position, they will look to try and find a solution to that. They will try and solve it. That's like human nature. And so mechanically, that can create all sorts of really, really interesting things. Because suddenly you're not looking at the problem as like all this variance. You can look at it as completely binary. That will not work. That will not work. But this will work. And now you start to create interesting tunnels that people can go down. There's all sorts of systems that we can create for that. Yeah.
Lynne, how does sort of Chaosium handle that kind of stuff, like sort of like community rules and that kind of thing that come out as sort of, because obviously like Call of Cthulhu is like very well established, been around for a very long time. So how does like Chaosium approach like people like sort of like creating their own rule sets, that kind of thing? Do you engage with it, or do you just let them at it, or?
Or we let them get on with it. I mean, occasionally, if people tell me a cool rule, I might use it in my own games. I won't necessarily write it into anything. Not without crediting them, obviously.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's what we said before. Once you've bought that book, that's yours.
Yeah.
Go forth, have fun, do with it what you need to do, what enables you to enjoy it and tell stories with your friends. No, there is not a little video camera in the spine watching your every move and reporting back to us, honest. So yeah, and again, people adapting rules, it's that creativity, it's that ownership. It's like, oh, this isn't quite working for us, but what if we just do this? Yeah. And that's fantastic. Which one of the things I love at the gaming table as well. I love running convention games because you never know who's going to turn up and you never know what they're going to say, and that keeps you on your toes. And quite often, and watching the little routes that people go down, and they'll go, oh, I bet it's this, and you're thinking as GM, well, it wasn't, but it is now. Because that's A, cool, and B, obviously what you're interested in, so let's go do that, because that sounds fun.
Yeah, I have a distinct memory. Many, many years ago, I put out a little card game called Revenge of the Bee-Movie, and I was selling it at a Dragon Meet, I think it was, down in London.
I think my husband bought a copy.
I got invited to Sweden because of Revenge of the Bee-Movie, because one of the organisers had a copy and was like, hey, would you like to come across to our convention?
Wow.
So I got to do that earlier this year because of that, weirdly. But yeah, I walked past the table playing it, and I was like, oh, that's my game, how are you enjoying it? I was like, yeah, we're enjoying it, but we're making our own cards, it's fine. So I was like, whatever, I've got your money. Thanks, yeah, it's yours. Do with it as you will. I don't mind. Yeah, so like taking that sort of stuff and making a thing of it it's cool. Like they can come up with better ideas.
I was having a thought about folklore and the role of heavily defined known and the discovery of that. If anyone here knows the game Elden Ring, it's a video game. You have a character. You are fighting these epic monsters and bosses, and they have these specific animated movesets. The animations they have are extremely they're regimented. They're beautiful. They flourish, but they're set paths. They get locked into these animations and they do them. And there's this level of skill of navigating around, watching enemies do these different movesets, how they react to you, what you do in return. The kind of the fighting set, like you swing your sword or you move your hammer. And you have your own animation, so you're in this dance, this locked dance of I've started this animation, they've started this animation, now are we going to time and hit at the right moment, do I need to dodge, and do I need to cancel out of this animation? And while this is very regimented and calculated and skill-based, a folklore evolves around the learning of these patterns, the engaging with these enemies, the experience of, when I went into this arena and the music was playing and then he summoned that lightning and I didn't know what to do next, and the kind of the recounting of that from person to person, almost the trial of moving through them, you get this sort of hero's journey of playing the game and recounting that to other players. And then when you see people who know these different bosses so expertly that they can expertly dodge around them and nimbly and do these 0 hit runs where they don't take a single point of damage the entire game they play, it almost becomes Herculean. The 12 challenges, 13 how many challenges Hercules did. And it's kind of funny because they'll also probably go around running around naked as well, just like Hercules. It's folklore and how we engage with this material. So even when we have something that is very regimented, we can still get from that an experience that we can contrast and exchange and share. And so when it comes to role-playing games, even if we have to define a monster with a stat block, even if we have to set a challenge with specific conditions that we say so-and-so wants this and this and this, otherwise they're not going to make this deal to give water to the village, you can still get folklore from that. So it's not just the folklore inspiring the story you're telling, but also the folklore that you're encouraging people to generate as they speak and engage with the experience that you've curated.
Yeah.
Maybe sort of like a couple of recommendations from the panel before we move to the audience for some questions. So what I'd like to know is maybe something that you'd like to, like a bit of folklore or something you'd like to work on in the future, something you'd like to, like a game you'd like to work on that's based on some sort of folklore, and maybe a recommendation of something outside of your own, outside of this panel and outside of your own work, which uses folklore in an interesting way that you could recommend.
Yeah. I mean, recommendations-wise, like I've just finished reading Unraveler by Frances Harden G. I think you pronounce it that way, which is an amazingly well, inspired by British folklore, delving into this concept of the deep wells and fey contracts and curses, and it has completely changed how I think about curses, how I think about these strange creatures that live outside of our concept of reality. Unraveler. Definitely, highly recommend it. As for working with folklore, I was actually trying to create a game that takes the concept of the Brothers Grimm's with their fairy tales, but mix it with 80 days. So it's a solo RPG where you're going around the whole world trying to make a new Grimm's tome with folklore from all different countries, but running into that problem of I don't belong to these cultures, and in order to get people who belong to each of these cultures for how many countries are recognized by the UN? How many of those have multiple cultures in them? It became too big a project and unfortunately had to be shelved. But I would love to do that at one point.
Cool. For yourself, Lynne?
Well, I'm kind of working on my dream project actually. I'm not going to say I relentlessly hunted Ben down, but I did wait till he turned up at Newcastle to do a book signing and stalked him, got to the front of the queue, and then went, have you ever fancied having a role-playing game?
When you say you work with Ben, he's not just in your basement?
Or No, I'm not allowed to keep him in my basement. No, I do have to let him out.
Oh, okay.
So no, I've been very lucky. I got to work on the dream project that I wanted to work on. Yes, obviously, it gives me a lot of scope to go do stuff. I do work very closely with Ben. He's very generous in what we are allowed to do. And he gets very excited about the whole thing. So, we'll talk about ideas, and then he'll go away and see if he can work out how it would fit into the world.
Sure.
Because obviously he's done certain things with things like vampires and werewolves that aren't people's sort of preconceptions of what they are. So you do have to think carefully about, how do other folkloric creatures work in this world? Are they what people expect? Are they something completely different?
Yeah.
Is there a reason why people think they're one way when actually they're something completely not that? In terms of recommendations, some of Guy Gavriel Kay's early novels are very interesting, playing with history and folklore and myth. I will put a content warning on his first trilogy, The Fiona of Our Tapestry. It's a retelling of Arthurian myth, and it gets pretty dark in some places, so just be careful with that one. But it's either Song for Arbonne or Tagana does some really clever things. It's been a while since I read them. And I'm also going to say The Dark is Rising by Susan Cooper, which is technically a children's book, but is a fantastic look at mythology and creating its own world of mythology while incorporating elements of other myths and legends. Also the one that follows it, Greenwich, which has the most beautiful, kind solution to the problem that is not the one that you're expecting to happen. And it's nice to see that in that type of book, that she doesn't go for the obvious solution.
Yourself, Pablo?
So I think I've been working on this game for years. The Old King's Crown. I'm the illustrator and designer of it, and it's nearly finished. And it's been years of drawing and designing that thing. And in a way, this relates to this. It's that world partially is solved for me. Those characters are they have locked in some ways, and all the ambiguities that I've kept in there. Even that has a degree of rigidity to it. So I'm looking forward to approaching that world from another angle, introducing another element into that. And I'm not bound really because of my interest in keeping space open. I'm not bound to do certain things. So I'm looking forward to delving back, and once it's finished, I have to hand it in, and then I have to go to sleep for a month. But after that's done, I'm looking forward to kind of the redress of the thing, to look at it from afar and go, well, what interests me about this world now? You know, this little folkloric thing that I've created. So I'm very, very excited about that. And I would say that if I had recommendations, I'd say that there'd be two. George Mackay Brown, who's an Orcadian poet, and he wrote a lot of poetry, and he also wrote short stories. And he took a lot of history and a lot of folklore into short stories. And I just think they're very like lovely little human stories that really feel like they're perched on the edge of a big ocean. You know, where Orkney is, it really feels that way. And I also say that Ursula Le Guin, which I came incredibly late to the party, I only read Earthsea recently, and oh my goodness, I've actually only read the first two books, but the second one in particular, Tombs of Atuan, oh my God, what a setting, what a place, like just really great fantasy without violence, or like without the, it isn't solved with swords, it isn't like it's just really weird and human, again like perched on the edge of so much unknown. There's so much unknown in those books. There's just a series of islands and a big mad sea in between them, and these kind of threads of magic or lore that connects them, and everything else is just left up to imagination. Amazing.
So, I guess for my next project, I get where you're coming from, Pablo, with like the finishing, because Carved in Stone I've been working on for 5 years. I'm like, it's nearly done. Yeah. I'm doing layout and art direction. I'm like, soon. When you finish something that momentous, you have to take a step back and just be like, God, the scope of this thing, to take it all in, and then you might want to just dive back in, or you might want to go in a new direction, or orbit it and slingshot somewhere else. So I would love to do more picked stuff. That sounds really, really fun. I like exploring the human stories. That's been my favorite part of Carved in Stone, is taking all of the different emotions, all of the different like love and relations and friendships and fights and petty like spiteful stuff and just like inconveniences, and exploring what that could look like in different societies and scales, and what is it like to live in a group of 100 people, and it's a day's hike to the next village, and there's no fast way out from that. It's just, that's how it is. You have these 100 people, you have to get along with them, and you do, and you grew up with them, and what is that like? Those sorts of stories. So I think having then done all of like the history and the presentation and the building the kind of the foundation, I want to go back in and just write little adventures. So that's what I want to do. And for recommendations, I have two things. The first is something I read very recently. It only just came out. It's Beyond the Pale published by Lost Pages. It's by Yokogal. It's a short OSR adventure. You're in a small town. It's inspired by sort of like, I say Jewish mythology because there's a lot of like creatures like golems and stuff like that. There's like, it's very, very Jewish. All of the writers are Jewish. The whole team is Jewish except for the layout artist. They have a beautiful kind of just like summary and discussion of this at the end of the book. And it's such an exciting premise because all of the different knot of different stories, very short, very tight, happening all together at once. And every single character is approached as if they are someone who you could ally with. There is never an assumption of fighting to solve anything, even though there are some. There is like a bit of body horror in this, and sort of like possibly world-ending catastrophe coming in like 3 days in this adventure, and it's just so delicious. I really enjoyed that. And then the other one I would recommend, kind of discussing this blend of like folklore and culture. You'll have to bootleg it because it's not available anymore, but it's any of the Thousand Island books. They're these small zines that sort of are from a Southeast Asian team. Just delicious, some of the most delightful writing I've ever had. The joy of reading, the illustrations are so stripped back and simple. It's just incredible. You feel like you are in each of the thousand islands when you're reading, and each zine is one island. There are about 20 zines. The team is no longer working together. They are no longer available digitally. You can only find them if you have a friend who has a PDF. So I recommend making a lot of friends and trying to find them.
So, has anyone got any questions for our panel? Folklore, fantasy, and other things? Yeah.
Question for Lynne. movie, I think. So I suspect you've been asked this before, but I was listening to you describe how Ben gets excited by the game, the prospects, and intuitive ways to work out how it might be possible. Has plans or actions in Rivers of London role-playing games affected the fiction to your knowledge?
Not yet. But he keeps telling me, every now and again, some of my authors have written some amazing stuff. All of my authors have written some amazing stuff. Let me re-clarify that. They've all written amazing stuff. And Ben will go, oh, I like that. I'm nicking that. As far as I know, none of it has turned up yet. But it may. Particularly for the America source book, which we're putting the finishing touches to now, because there's not an awful lot in America in the novels and the novellas. We've been given a lot more freedom, and I'm nicking that has been heard quite a few times as he's been reviewing the documents. So, watch this space.
Sorry, I realised I should repeat the gentleman's question for the cast that's going to go out. So, Lynne was just answering the question about whether the sort of like, basically the fiction, Ben has like taken stuff from suggestions to go back into the actual novels themselves out of the games. Has anyone else got a question? Yes.
So when you were talking earlier about sparking interest and leaving people space, how do you think about people having different pre-existing knowledge of different folklores? Because I feel like if you don't know as much, then it's harder for you to take your own take on it. So how do you but then if you know a lot, then you get the nodded references. Like, how do you balance those sorts of things?
So basically, sort of how do you deal with like consumer sort of pre-knowledge of like those folklore tropes? Yeah, for everyone, I think that one.
Well, for solo RPGs, because like the pace is a lot slower, this can be an excellent opportunity to encourage people to go and research. Because you're writing it yourself, you've got hours to go and research and be like, oh, so that's what a Kusith is, that's how a Banshee works, that's where that story comes from. Oh, there's this like weird, obscure bit of knowledge that I'm going to like put into my journal because that excites me. But like at the table with a group, I think you would want to try and like solve it in a sense, like try and have as much information that the GM, or if it's GM-less, have like as much as the players need to know to still make it mechanically and narratively engaging, without potentially doing too much, without like pushing the players too much to be like, this is exactly what it does. Like if it's exposed to fire, it will do this. If it's exposed to cold, it will do this. Because at that point, it becomes not a monster anymore, not an interesting piece of folklore, in my opinion.
I think there's something very interesting about leveraging what people perceive they know against them. So, for example, a werewolf is not frightening if it is vulnerable to silver, but if everybody believes that it's vulnerable to silver and suddenly they are confronted with something that is not vulnerable to silver, then you've used that expectation against them, and you've reasserted the potential fear or the scope of this thing. So I think you can use that in interesting ways. And I would also argue, I'm coming at this from a different thing, which is not tabletop role-playing games, but I think there's interesting things you can do mechanically where you can use mechanical complexity to stand in for a complex idea. So something might be mechanically complex, and as a result, it's that is felt by the players. It's felt by the table, and that can be really interesting. So that can create all sorts of like interesting cogs. And if a system is seamless, if it doesn't have resistance, then you lose that particular dial, right? Like if storytelling or making things is just a series of dials, like it's very beautiful, or it's very frightening, or it's very challenging, or it's difficult, and all these sorts of things, then I think that's one that you can really use. I think you can make it mechanically complex or mechanically easy, and use that to augment what it is that you're trying to achieve.
Sort of mechanics as emotions more.
Yeah.
Something that I've considered a lot with like mythology and folklore on a bunch of the projects I've worked on is that my books tend to be for a wide age range. So it's sort of like, it's not just kids, it's not just adults, it's kids and up.
And something that's really, really fun about writing for kids is that they just you say something to them, and they're like, I believe that now. I've taken that in. This is their first experience of a thing. And that can be very liberating because it allows you to, again, like, redefine this thing. These werewolves aren't hurt by silver. Like, they're fine with that. And to an audience that has no knowledge of this, they'll just go, well, okay, werewolves. And they will never have the conception that silver is something that hurts them. And we see that in all forms of media where people subvert a trope, and that's the first person's observation of that subversion, and that becomes the core trope for them. The regular trope is now the subversion of that, and that can be really fun and liberating. So I wouldn't worry too much about educating the audience. I would just want to make something that feels consistent and fun within the world that you are now creating from your own experience.
And of course, you can totally mess with them by going, well, this is what people believe this creature is.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I was speaking to John Hodgson from Handiwork Games just before I came up to the talk, actually, and they've got a game coming out called Five Evil, which is it's horror 5th edition, and the guy who made it is a friend of mine called Morgan Davey, and basically John's saying that he has basically subverted what you expect 5th edition to do in order to make players incredibly scared of how incompetent they are in those particular situations. So it's coming back to what you were saying there, Pablo, about the sort of mechanics sort of becoming emotion. So yeah, it's a fascinating idea, that.
You're great.
Love ideas. Has anybody else got any other questions? Yes?
So me again, right, sorry.
That's right.
We, at the start of this, we've heard about folklore being a lens you adapt to help you understand. We talked about if you open in each generation, putting their own spin on it. We talked about making it your own shared story in the Lovecraft sense. We just talked about having fun with it, but also we're told don't steal it, don't devour it. How do you square that circle?
So we're talking about sort of how do you like consume just enough folklore to make it like okay to like to use.
How can you twist it and make it your own if you're not allowed to make it your own?
So,
So
this comes down to like your personal moral philosophy on it. Obviously, if you are okay taking something from like East Asian culture and putting it into your game, I mean, if you're interested in it, then in my opinion, that's fine. That's enough. Like, it's when you're in our position as creators that you have a bit more responsibility for the stuff you're creating. So obviously, like if you're writing a story, you're doing your own research, you're creating something, and you are trying to approach it in hopefully a way that is like responsible. If you're a creator and you're putting something out there, then people expect you to do that work and to talk to people who know. They expect you to be correct about it. So if I put something in from like East Asian lore, like in the Philippines, then if I've not done my research and people get that as their first introduction to that creature, then I have almost tainted the well, like because I have put in something that might be like spitting in the face of what that story is meant to tell. I mean, like talking about like saint worship earlier, like St. Patrick, that's about killing pagans, but we don't really tell it like that way anymore now. So he killed snakes. Yeah, wink. So if you don't know that about another culture's folklore, then you run the risk of basically having this like colonial mindset to it, where it's just like, oh, that's a fun story, and not taking along the actual real world implications of it as well, which, yeah, if you're not responsible, could be very offensive to people, could be very hurtful, it could be things that are like still affecting groups of people in some way, and you've just taken it and you've went, yeah, these are the heroes.
And I've made money off it.
Yeah, and I've made money off of it.
Yeah.
So take it, but be respectful.
Be respectful. Do your
Always be
research.
respectful.
Yeah, do your
Yeah.
research. Try and understand it as best you can. I disagree with like the concept of like cultural appropriation in the sense that you are only allowed to use your culture, because I feel that like pigeonholes people and makes them afraid to touch other cultures, like to go and engage with them in any like meaningful way. I think it is good to go and engage with like other mythologies. Like my library at home is filled with books on like African mythology, Norse mythology, Egyptian and Chinese. Like I love these stories, but if I was to try and adapt them into a product, then I would want to go and speak to someone who knows even more than I do, preferably someone who can tell me the real world implications of these stories and the cultural things that I might overlook because I don't have that background.
most famous example I can think of in our community of like people not doing that research was when Kill Many or Not released Rising Sun, and there was a monster they had in it that was like basically created by a guy in Australia on Wikipedia, and had nothing to do with the mythology of that culture at all in any way or form. And Kill Many or Not had obviously just Wikipedia'd it and gone, that'll do.
And then you've got things like the Wendigo, which has a very specific cultural significance to Indigenous Americans that most people, like in the West, have just gone, oh, cool, icy cannibal, that'll do. And it's like, no, there are, as you say, cultural repercussions to some of these creatures that if you're not aware of them, you can be accidentally offensive and make people very uncomfortable. And that's the last thing any of us want to do. But, you've just got to be careful, respectful, talk to people who know about these things, as Anna said, and they will quite often spark ideas that you never thought of because they're sharing their understanding with you and giving you a different viewpoint. And that just enriches everything when you have those different viewpoints and learn, see those different ideas. Because we've all been brought up in a reasonably similar way. We have a particular way of thinking because we've been culturally conditioned for that. And getting input from other cultures, communities, is fascinating. I love it because that sparks creativity, it sparks originality, and it does teach. It is educational, which again, as we coming back to the beginning again, folklore, one definition of it is to educate through stories.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think one of the most important things is that it can engender curiosity in other cultures. That's perfect. That's exactly what you want. I think the crucial thing is to acknowledge the limitations of your own understanding. So I think if you go into it and you're like, I've got this thing, I understand the shape and form of it. Like so many times we were talking about understanding something completely, or if you just solve a thing, if you say I've solved it, it's this thing. Then if you do that and if you apply that to other things that you do not understand, then that's when I think you run afoul of things. But I think taking inspiration or like educating yourself about things is the best. Like I think we should encourage that across the board. Learning is good, but thinking that you know it all, that's bad, right?
To take a step sideways to put my other hat on, I teach historical embroidery techniques, hand embroidery techniques, largely because sewing machines try to kill me every time I go near them. And it's one of the things I found was, people were very keen, like, oh no, I want to do all this amazing cool stuff with it. But unless you've understood the basic technique, you can't exploit it creatively and well because you don't know what the underpinning rules are and how to flex them without totally breaking them. I mean, you might want to totally break them, but if you don't know what they are, how do you know you're breaking them? So yes, having that crucial fundamental understanding, that underpinning knowledge is fantastic because if you do understand something, you can really let it rip.
Yeah, you can pull it apart. Yeah.
Any other questions? Yellow.
Hi, everyone. This is a question for everybody, but mostly for the flat earth in the middle. My main question is, to summarize it up, at what point does a conspiracy become worthy enough to be deemed as folklore?
So when does conspiracy theory become acceptable on folklore? Yeah.
No. I think they are one and the same thing. I think it's very exciting to think of the two things as the same thing, which is that they are both. They are all people trying to rationalize things that feel frightening or unfamiliar or new or different or unique to them, right? There's a lot of people who believe a lot of things that other people do not believe, and they believe them because that they feel that that's their lived experience, or they imagine that that's a lived experience that makes them feel that way, right? Or for me, I can't see that the world's round, so I'm just going to assume it's flat, right? That's my, it's. I think they are one and the same thing. I think it's why, we started this discussion. I think that as news seems to become more unreliable because it's so quick and it's so unchecked, and editorial becomes so valuable because there is a financial incentive to hyperpolarize people. So editorial becomes more and more valuable in modern discourse. You can create folkloric elements in the immediacy. You can create them right now. There are. I don't want to get political about it, so I'm not going to name specifics. But there are plenty of instances I could say in the last few months around certain events that have become almost folkloric, almost mythic, in they're polarizing to people, and people attach belief systems to them. Entire things that have happened, they do it. That's myth making. That's folklore. So yeah, I think they're one and the same thing. And I think that paranoia is a great tool if you want to push people into that kind of thinking. I think it can create all sorts of interesting things.
To sort of add to that, I feel like these sort of conspiracy theories, essentially you've got like fantasy and that's folklore, and you have conspiracy theories, and you have horror. They are similar forms of inspiration. And to kind of pull on the previous question as well of like, how do you not devour a source? How do you respectfully use sources? It's about being respectful and compassionate and empathetic of who you're drawing or where you're drawing your inspiration from. It's not cool to take conspiracy theorists, take their theories, and they make fun of them in a story. A lot of conspiracy theorists are victims. They are scared and afraid, and they're being manipulated by people who want to take money from them, to take the influence from them, to take advantage of them. It's how they get to these sorts of spaces. And you can be inspired by, you can draw parallels, and the more you empathize, I feel, with these people, the more you can tell a better story, because now you're finding what resonated with them in this theory that made them believe it. What resonated with me? How could I find this believable? How do I explore this in a story? Maybe to break this down, to help people out of this space. Like, that's a large element of it.
Anyone else? Any other questions? Yeah.
Hi, second question, also open to everyone else this time, but specifically probably for something close to a Call of Cthulhu writer. When it comes to folklore that can be added on, and how do I put this in a way that makes sense? When it comes to folklore that is written, that's pre-written, and you may add your own take upon that folklore, is there going to be any worry that your addition to the folklore would become part of that folklore? And if so, when is that allowed to happen? In what folklores is it okay to add more to it? And is it and what folklores is it alright for you just to make sure it stays exactly the same?
So we're sort of talking about like when we're creating these things, if as we're adding to them, when does it become part of that folklore going forward, and when people then take what we've added and assume it's part of that folklore, when is that okay?
Oh, that's a good one.
It is.
You're just practicing for tomorrow's panel, aren't you, Lloyd?
No.
I mean, I suppose that's the danger of every time we do anything, is the fact that it can end up being incorporated into what the public sees and accepts. And, I mean, with historical games like Call of Cthulhu, real-world games with like Rivers of London, it's a case of that you're grounding it in reality but twisting it slightly. So the more successful you are at that, the harder it becomes for people to see where those boundaries are. When I was working on Acton Cthulhu, somebody actually came up to me and said, I've been searching all over for this society. I can't find anything on them. It's like, well, okay, great, that means I did my job, but oops.
I feel like, just to add to that, because again, writing about the Picts, writing about the people that we have little evidence, you can disclaim as much as you want, but you can't control what someone will take from what you create. There's a level of absolution there where you can say, I mean, at the very beginning of the book, I say, this book is Pict-ish, it is not Pictish. If that makes sense. Because ultimately, there will be someone who will read this, and they won't read the disclaimers, and they won't read the context, and they won't understand whatever it is that you're trying to do, and they will just take this as canon. Humanity is a community, and so ultimately you have to trust that there will be other sources there to help course correct them, so long as you've also done your due diligence to pre-course correct, to say this is an adaptation, this is an evolution, we've added our own spins in. It's why stuff like the recommendation I made earlier, Into the Pale or Beyond the Pale.
Beyond the Pale.
Beyond the Pale.
Yeah.
At the end of the book, they say, this is an all-Jewish team, but we worked with one Gentile. This is not truly, authentically a fully Jewish project, but we believe it is in our hearts because the writers, the illustrators, the people doing a lot of the creative work were. And so that's them paying their honor to their own, stories and things they want to pass on forwards. You just do the best you can.
There's also, a lot of folklore has worked through time. We can create as much as we like, but at the end of the day, if you want, the true story, you have to go and look at what researchers are looking at. Go look at these, the oldest possible versions of the stories, because, a lot of, Gallic stories, they're all destroyed because of Christianity. It's just, I got a, Gallic, phrase book, and it doesn't have any swear words because it was all just Christian monks writing everything down, and they didn't want to store those words. And it's the same with folklore. A lot of those stories are gone. So the versions we have are not the originals anymore. So our additions to it are just continuing this tradition.
And of course, because a lot of it was verbal, it was, oral tradition. Yes, it's going to change in the telling because people's memory is faulty. It's not going to remember everything exactly correctly. It's a big game of historical Chinese whispers. Things change, things morph. As we've said, people put their own spins on things. Even going back to the very earliest version does not mean that is the original version. Stories change over time. And again, I think this brings the respect element in. As long as you're respectful and it brings something interesting for people, maybe it's not so bad.
I think it's by its very nature additive. I think each iteration will just add something to it, and it's not. You can't disclaimers are very important, and actually very useful for education and for adding a disclaimer about your position. But in making something new, you are adding to something that came before, and sometimes that will mean that you erase things that came before because one will sit on top of the other and it will negate the other. But when we make things, we are adding to the previous history, and we are subverting it, or we are morphing it, or we are enshrining it. Oral histories will be elevated by the best storytellers. Those rose to prominence, and so that version of the story was vetted by their particular public, and it became the enduring version. And then it got subverted by, a new religious culture coming in, or a period of famine changed the nature of the story, and so on. Right? It's I think that's okay. I think that is the nature of it.
You've reminded me of another book recommendation. I cannot remember the author's name. It's a non-fiction book, and it's called The Fairy Tellers. And it looks at the development of certain fairy stories and the most well-known author of those stories. And it is a really fascinating read. So I will definitely recommend that one as well.
I think we've got maybe time for one more quick question. Sure.
So, I'm putting a massive link between a lot of the answers to the last few questions, where stories that we're telling, folklore that we're building, even just whether we choose to take something from another culture and incorporate it is all dependent on how well we understand those things and how well we understand the world around us. There's a bit there about conspiracy theories and disclaimers as well about ensuring that the people we're building these stories with or for don't go too far down that garden path into maybe having that as the foundation of their beliefs, or building upon their understanding of the way that the world works and so on. But we've also had a question earlier, we've had a discussion earlier about age groups and such. So while we may have disclaimers for adults who are consuming these things or playing these things, how much more responsibility, if any, do we have for younger participants in this story and so on?
Do you mean in sort of the games these folks are producing?
Not necessarily those games, but whether it's for kids and things like this, or just generally, it's the first instance where a kid comes across a vampire. How much more responsibility do we have, or a conspiracy theory? How much responsibility do we have to ensure that they understand this is just a game, even though there's real world stuff going on that
So you're asking about how responsibility changes depending on sort of intended audience, and if it's a younger audience, how does that sort of change what we say in terms of disclaimers and like sort of saying about sort of cultural context?
Disclaimers, but we still have responsibility to younger audiences to ensure.
So yeah, how do you deal?
I have really strong opinions that we should just show everything. We shouldn't censor. We should trust kids a lot more than we currently do. They are overly coddled and they don't get shown things at appropriate ages. They don't get a chance to be like, oh, what the heck is this? Form opinions and then still ask people while they're still in safer spaces, and they become adults and their first experience of many different topics all across the whole board of everything. They start having these sort of like experiences in their 20s and they have no idea what to do with them. So in terms of like, at what age do we show topics? I think there's a degree of safety. You find an appropriateness towards the age in terms of exact content, but themes should be all ages, no censorship to the degree of, you shouldn't censor sex from all ages, but you have the degree to which you show and why and what purpose and what stories you're kind of introducing for the correct age group, because then you don't get people who are like in their 20s and just only learning how sex works then from their friends because they weren't taught correctly. When we talk about disclaiming what should be kind of like what is being talked about, like if you have a game about a conspiracy theory that is meant to be immersive and it's actually meant to make you experience the conspiracy theory, should there be disclaimers to say this is a conspiracy theory, this isn't true, even though that might invalidate the immersion of the game? I think that is important. And we see why with a lot of YouTubers and live streamers and sort of like viral games, they are hand over fist taking advantage of children and the money they have and exploiting them in the most disgusting ways. And it goes completely unchecked because it brings in money. These disclaimers are important. We do need to make sure that we're safeguarding children and how we present media to them, but we shouldn't be coddling them because they need to become adults. They need to become humans. We need to
learn the critical thinking skills to look at that and go, how does this affect me? What is it? Is this truth? Is this fiction? Is this exploitation? And that's it. And I think, I mean, sorry for interrupting you.
Oh, no, please.
No, I'm getting on a bit. My generation, according to my friend Bob Fisher, who writes for 14 Times, is the haunted generation. Because the stuff that we were allowed to watch when we were kids that was actually made as children's programming is terrifying. Absolutely terrifying. In fact, friends of ours did the Scarred for Life books. If you don't know how terrifying, I highly recommend that you go and have a look at that and see the sorts of nonsense we were allowed to watch as 5 and 6 year olds. But yes, the difference in what is targeted as children's programming these days compared to the, oh, don't worry about it, it's just a Victorian ghost that's trying to murder her so she can have her as a friend forever. You know, oh, this is all the horrible ways you're going to die on a farm. You know, things like that. Yes, so it's the whole thing with children is be honest and have those discussions. And I think a lot of the time people are afraid to have those discussions because you say they don't treat children as thinking beings. I mean, think back to when you were little. You had the most boundless imaginations. You were creating your own folklore, running around, having a great time. And then that kind of gets trained out of you. And I think that's the saddest thing, really, is that somewhere along the way we lose our wonder and we lose our willingness to engage with folklore. And as gamers, we are very lucky in many ways in the fact that we've retained some of that. There's an awful lot of people don't get to do that. Children are a lot more emotionally literate than people will give them credit for.
Okay, well, I think that's our time up, folks. So thank you very much for coming. Big round of applause for our panelists. Thank you so much for